Wife and her lawyer lover stole my 6.7. Then I found Grandpa's 1960 account that changed everything. It didn't happen overnight. The betrayal was a slow poison, the kind you don't notice until your heart stops beating. My wife, Laura, and my best friend Frank destroyed me. They took my company, my home, my dignity, and every penny I had earned over 20 years of hard work. But they didn't know about my grandfather, or the secrets he buried in dusty old boxes. This is the story of how I used a forgotten past to build a future they never saw coming, and how I made them pay for every single lie. My wife and her lawyer lover stole my 6.7 memories, but my grandfather's 1960 account changed everything. They thought they destroyed me. Subscribe and like to see how I made them pay for their lies. Our life had been perfect, or so I thought. I was Thomas, a man who had built a successful tech company from the ground up. Laura was the beautiful, supportive wife who stood by me. Frank was my lawyer, my confidant, the guy I trusted with my business and my life. We were a team. They would come over for barbecues on Sundays. Our kids, who were grown and living their own lives, loved them both. I thought I had it all. The big house in a quiet suburb, the respect of my peers, a loving family. It was the American dream, packaged and delivered. The first crack appeared when I noticed money moving in ways that didn't make sense. Small amounts at first. Frank would explain it away with a smile, calling it aggressive accounting to save on taxes. He'd clap me on the shoulder and say, "That's what you pay me for, Thomas, to find the loopholes." Laura would nod, her eyes full of admiration for Frank's cleverness and my success. I was a fool. I was so blinded by my trust in them that I didn't see the web they were weaving around me. The day it all came crashing down was a Tuesday. I came home early from a business trip wanting to surprise Laura. I found them in my office, not in bed, which would have been a simpler kind of pain. They were hunched over my desk, signing papers. My papers. They looked up and there was no shock on their faces. There was no guilt. There was only cold, hard victory. "Thomas," Laura said, her voice calm, as if she were telling me we were out of milk. "It's over." Frank smirked, leaning back in my chair, his feet on my desk. "We've initiated a majority buyout," he said, holding up a document. "All legal. You signed the power of attorney years ago, my friend. You just weren't paying attention." They had systematically drained my company, moving assets into shell corporations they controlled. They had remortgaged my house to its breaking point. The $6.7 million wasn't just cash. It was my entire life's work, my retirement, my children's inheritance. It was all gone. "Why?" I whispered, the word barely making a sound. Laura laughed. It was a sound I'd never heard before, sharp and ugly. "Because we were tired of being in your shadow, Thomas. You were always the star. We just wanted our turn, and we're better at this game than you are." They threw me out of my own house that day. The security guards they'd hired didn't even let me get a change of clothes. I stood on the curb with nothing but the wallet in my pocket and the suit on my back, watching them through the window as they toasted with my best scotch. The next few weeks were a blur of shame and despair. My bank accounts were frozen. My credit cards were declined. My name was dragged through the mud in the local business news, painted as an incompetent fool who ran his own company into the ground. I lost everything. I ended up in a cheap motel, the kind where you don't ask about the stains on the carpet. I had one place left to go, my grandfather's old house. It had been sitting empty for years. A forgotten property on the edge of town that nobody wanted. It was dusty, neglected, and filled with ghosts of my childhood. It was also the only roof I had left in the world. I spent my days cleaning out the clutter of a life long past, trying to make the place livable. One afternoon I was in the attic, wrestling with a heavy wooden trunk. The lock was rusted shut. Driven by a mix of frustration and boredom, I pried it open with an old screwdriver. Inside, beneath yellowed newspapers and moth-eaten clothes, was a small leather-bound ledger. It looked like a bank book. I opened it. The entries were handwritten in my grandfather's neat script, dating from 1958 to 1965. There were deposits and withdrawals, notes in the margins about stocks and investments I didn't understand. The last entry showed a significant balance, but the account was from a small, independent bank that had been bought out decades ago. It was a dead end, I thought, just another piece of the past. But then, tucked into the back cover, I found something else. A single, folded piece of paper. It wasn't a bank statement. It was a certificate, a bearer bond from a Swiss bank, and next to it, a small, ornate metal key. I had no idea what it meant, but for the first time in months I felt a spark. It wasn't hope, not yet. It was curiosity, a thread, a tiny, almost invisible thread in the darkness that had become my life, and I knew I had to pull it. The key was cold in my hand. It was small, but it felt heavy, like it held the weight of a life I never knew. For days, I just looked at it and the bearer bond. They were relics from another time, fragile pieces of paper that could either be my salvation or just another cruel joke. The despair was a thick fog, and it was hard to see a path through it, but that little little key was a flicker of light, a single point to focus on. I knew I couldn't do this alone. I was broke, powerless, and legally outmaneuvered. I needed someone who understood the old ways of money, someone from my grandfather's world. The name that came to mind was Walter. He was my grandfather's accountant and friend, a man now well into his 80s, sharp as a tack but living a quiet, retired life. I hadn't seen him in years, not since the funeral. Finding his number took some digging, but I eventually found him listed in an old address book. I met him at a small coffee shop, the kind with worn-out vinyl booths. I felt ashamed, sitting there in my slightly wrinkled suit, the only one I had. I laid the ledger, the bond, and the key on the table. Walter put on his glasses and peered at the documents. His hands were steady as he turned the pages of the ledger. He didn't say anything for a long time. He just read, his brow furrowed in concentration. "I remember your grandfather talking about this," he finally said, his voice a low rumble. "He called it his rainy day fund, a storm shelter," he said. "He never trusted banks after the Great Depression, especially not the big ones." He examined the bearer bond, a Swiss account, very clever for his time. "These things are like cash. Whoever holds the paper owns the money. But this bank, Bauer & C, they were bought out in the 70s, absorbed by a larger financial group." My heart sank. Another dead end. "Don't look so defeated, son," Walter said, tapping the paper. "It just means the money isn't lost. It's just moved. We have to follow the trail." For the next 2 weeks, Walter and I became detectives. He worked his old contacts, making calls to people I'd never heard of, speaking a language of finance that was completely foreign to me. We spent hours in the city's public library, scrolling through microfiche of old financial records, the air thick with the smell of dust and aging paper. It was a slow, painful process. Every lead seemed to branch into 3 more dead ends. While we were digging into the past, Laura and Frank were living it up in the present. I saw them on the cover of a local business magazine. They were standing in front of my old company headquarters, smiling. The headline read, "Power Couple Revitalizes Tech Giant." My company. They were being celebrated for stealing my life's work. Laura was wearing a necklace I'd bought her for our anniversary. Seeing that picture felt like a physical blow. It hardened something inside me that had gone soft with grief. The sadness was burning away, leaving something cold and sharp in its place. Revenge. Then we got a break. A former colleague of Walter's remembered the Bauer and CI merger. He told us which banking conglomerate had absorbed them, and, more importantly, how they archived the old accounts. It was a long shot, but we had a path. When I finally tracked down the records of the merger in a dusty basement archive, I thought I had found the confirmation of the account, but the file was almost empty. There was just a single typewritten note clipped to the inside of the folder. It wasn't an account statement, it was a transfer record. The funds weren't there anymore. They'd been moved in 1965 to a different private holding company, but I still didn't know what that key was for, or where the money was now. Walter looked at the transfer note and then at the ornate key on the table. A slow smile spread across his face. "Thomas," he said, his eyes gleaming, "I don't think your grandfather just had a bank account. I think he owned a piece of the bank itself." The key wasn't for a simple deposit box. It was for something much, much bigger. The trail wasn't cold. It had just led us out of the bank and towards something else entirely. And for the first time, I felt the genuine stirrings of power. Laura and Frank thought they had taken everything, but they had no idea what was buried in my family's past. The weight of Walter's words settled in the quiet coffee shop. Owning a piece of the bank. It sounded impossible, like something from a movie. My grandfather was a quiet man, a hardware store owner. He wasn't a tycoon. "How is that possible?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "Your grandfather was smarter than people gave him credit for," Walter said, packing the documents carefully back into his briefcase. He saw the world changing. He didn't trust the system, so he found a way to become part of a different one. Our first step is to find out what this holding company, Phoenix Investments, actually is. That name became our obsession. Phoenix Investments. It sounded powerful, but it was a ghost. We searched business registries, tax records, old newspapers, nothing. It was a private entity, designed to be invisible. For weeks, we hit nothing but brick walls. My meager savings were dwindling, spent on coffee, printing fees, and gas for my beat-up car. The hope that had sparked in me was beginning to flicker. One evening, I was driving back from the library feeling defeated. I took a different route to avoid traffic and passed by one of the most expensive restaurants in the city. And there, at a table by the window, I saw them, Laura and Frank. They were laughing, drinking champagne. Frank was telling a story, his hands moving animatedly. Laura was looking at him with the same adoring gaze she used to give me. He leaned over and kissed her, a long, possessive kiss right there in public. Something inside me snapped. It wasn't sadness anymore. It was a cold, clean rage. They were living my life, spending my money, and they didn't have a single care in the world. They were celebrating on the ruins of everything I had built. I pulled the car over and just watched them, letting the hatred burn away the last of my weakness. This wasn't just about getting my money back. This was about tearing their new world down, brick by brick. The next morning, I went to Walter with a new fire in my eyes. "We're looking in the wrong place," I said. "We're looking for a company. My grandfather didn't invest in companies, he invested in people." That simple change in perspective was everything. We stopped searching for Phoenix Investments and started searching for the people who signed the original bank merger documents back in the 70s. We were looking for a human connection. After another week of digging through archived legal filings, we found a name, Howard. He was a junior lawyer on the merger, the only one still listed as having a local practice, though he was now semi-retired. We found Howard in a small, dusty office above a tailor shop. He was a frail man with watery blue eyes and a surprisingly firm handshake. He listened patiently as we explained our story. I could see the skepticism on his face. To him, I was just another person chasing a long-lost family fortune. Then I placed the small, ornate key on his desk. Howard stopped breathing for a second. He stared at the key as if he'd seen a ghost. He didn't touch it. His eyes, which had been cloudy with age, were suddenly sharp and clear. He looked from the key to my face, then back again. "Where did you get this?" he asked, his voice tight. "It was my grandfather's," I said. I thought I had found the solution, the final link in the chain that would lead me to the money. But when Howard looked up from the key, his face was a mask of awe and fear. He slowly shook his head. "You don't understand," he whispered, a mysterious, almost reverent tone in his voice. "Your grandfather wasn't just an investor in the bank. He was one of the 5 founders of the Phoenix Group. The name wasn't for a company. It was for a secret consortium, a group of powerful men who pooled their resources outside the system. The key wasn't for a safe deposit box. It was a symbol of his seat at the table. I had thought I was looking for an old bank account, but what my grandfather had left me was something else entirely. It was a legacy of power. But if he was a founder, what happened to his share, and why was it all kept so secret, even from his own family?" The words hung in the air, heavy and unbelievable. A founder. My grandfather, the man who smelled of sawdust and old tobacco, who taught me how to fix a leaky faucet, was part of some secret group of power brokers. It didn't make sense. The Phoenix Group wasn't a business, Thomas, Howard continued, his voice low, as if the walls themselves might be listening. It was a pact. 5 men, all of whom had lost everything in the crash or the war. They swore they would never be at the mercy of governments or banks again, so they built their own system in the shadows. They invested in things before they were things. Land nobody wanted, technologies nobody understood. They operated with absolute secrecy and total loyalty. He gestured to the key on his desk. Each founder had a key. It grants access to their records, their assets, and most importantly, a vote. Your grandfather's seat has been dormant for 50 years. The other families, they've managed his share in trust as the pact dictates. The profits have been compounding for decades. A wave of dizziness washed over me. This was too much. "So, the money is there? The money is the least of it," Howard said, a serious look in his eyes. "What your grandfather left you is influence, access, power that can't be measured on a balance sheet, but it's not yours for the taking. You have to claim it." My mind was racing, connecting dots I never knew existed. The trips my grandfather took, the quiet phone calls, the way he always seemed to know things before they happened. It was all clicking into place. He hadn't just left me a rainy day fund. He'd left me a weapon. "What do I have to do?" I asked, my voice steady now. The shock was being replaced by a cold, sharp clarity. "You have to meet the current heads of the families," Howard explained. "You must present the key and state your claim. They will test you. They will not simply hand over a share of their world to an outsider, even one with the right blood." He told me the group was now led by a man named Edward, the son of one of the original founders. Edward was ruthless, brilliant, and fiercely protective of the group's secrecy. He saw the Phoenix Group not as a partnership, but as his own personal empire. He would not welcome a ghost from the past. I left Howard's office with my head spinning, but for the first time in a long time, I was walking with a purpose. I met Walter back at the coffee shop. I told him everything. He listened without interruption, his expression unreadable. When I finished, he took a long sip of his cold coffee. "This is dangerous, Thomas," he said quietly. "These aren't just rich men. They operate by their own rules. You're walking into a world you don't understand." "I don't have a choice," I said, the image of Laura and Frank laughing in that restaurant burning in my mind. "They took my world from me, Walter. This is my chance to build a new one they can't touch." I finally had the weapons and the proof of my legacy. Frank and Laura had no idea what was coming. They thought they had won. They were celebrating in my house, running my company, living my life. They believed I was a broken man in a cheap motel. In a few weeks, they would be the ones with nothing. Their world, built on lies and theft, was about to be turned to ash. But first, I needed to claim my birthright. I needed to face Edward and take my seat at the table. The meeting was set for the following week. It wasn't in a boardroom or a fancy office. It was at an old private library, a place that didn't appear on any maps. Walter helped me prepare. We researched Edward and the other 2 families. We learned about their businesses, their investments, their rivalries. Walter coached me on how to speak, how to carry myself. "Don't act like you're asking for a handout," he instructed. "You are not a guest. You are a founder, returning to claim what is yours. You must project power, even if you don't feel it." On the day of the meeting, I put on my only suit, which Walter had gotten professionally cleaned and pressed. It felt different now, less like a reminder of my failure and more like armor. As I walked towards the heavy oak doors of the library, the small metal key felt warm in my pocket. This wasn't just about money anymore. It was about reclaiming a legacy I never knew I had. It was about becoming the man my grandfather had prepared me to be all those years ago. Laura and Frank had stolen Thomas's life, but they were about to meet the grandson of a phoenix. I walked through the heavy oak doors and the world outside disappeared. The library was silent except for the soft rustle of turning pages from a man I couldn't see. The air smelled of old leather, wood polish, and something else, power. It was a deep, quiet room, lined from floor to ceiling with books that looked like they hadn't been touched in a century. In the center of the room, sitting in a large leather armchair, was a man in a perfectly tailored suit. He didn't look up when I entered. This had to be Edward. He held a glass of dark liquor, swirling it gently. He looked to be in his late 50s with silver hair and a face that seemed carved from stone. There was an arrogance in his posture, in the way he ignored my presence. He was making me wait, making me feel small. I remembered Walter's words. "You are not a guest." I cleared my throat, the sound unnaturally loud in the silence. "Edward," I said, my voice firmer than I expected. He finally raised his eyes. They were a pale, cold blue, and they sized me up in an instant, dismissing me just as quickly. "You must be Thomas," he said, his voice smooth but laced with boredom. "The ghost." I walked forward and stood before him. I didn't wait to be invited. I reached into my pocket, my fingers closing around the cool metal of the key. I placed it on the small table beside his chair. It made a soft click against the dark wood. Edward glanced at the key, his expression unchanged. There was no flicker of surprise like there had been with Howard. He already knew. Of course he knew. "A pretty little thing," he said dismissively. "My father had one just like it. What do you want, Thomas? Money? I can have my accountants write you a check. A generous one. Then you can go back to whatever life you were living and we can all forget this unfortunate interruption." He was testing me, offering me a bribe to disappear. The old me, the broken man from the motel, might have taken it, but that man was gone, burned away by rage and a newfound purpose. "I'm not here for a handout," I said, meeting his cold gaze. "I'm here to claim my grandfather's seat, his share. His vote." For the first time, a flicker of something crossed Edward's face. It wasn't anger. It was amusement. He let out a short, dry laugh. "His vote? You have no idea what you're asking for. You think this is a social club? A place where we sit around and reminisce about the good old days? This is a machine, Thomas, and you are a wrench that has fallen into the gears. You don't belong here." "My blood says I do," I countered, "and this key says I do." He leaned forward, the amusement gone, replaced by a predatory stillness. "Your blood means nothing. Your grandfather is a memory. His way of doing things is dead. The world is different now. It's faster, more brutal. What have you ever built, a tech company? I read about it. You let your wife and your lawyer take it from you like a child's toy. You are weak, and there is no room for weakness at this table." Every word was a calculated blow, designed to humiliate me, to make me doubt myself. He knew everything about my fall. He wanted me to feel the shame all over again, but it had the opposite effect. His contempt was fuel. "You're right," I said quietly. "I was weak. I was blind. I trusted the wrong people. I won't make that mistake again." Edward studied my face for a long moment, searching for a crack. When he found none, he leaned back in his chair, a slow, calculating smile spreading across his lips. "Very well. You want in? You'll have to earn it. Your grandfather's assets have been managed by the group for 50 years. They are substantial, far more than your little company was ever worth, but they are not yours. Not yet." He took a sip of his drink. "I have a problem, Thomas. A minor annoyance. A small investment firm that has become bold. They are trying to move in on one of our territories. They are led by a young, arrogant man who thinks he's smarter than he is." He set the glass down. "You will deal with this problem for me. You will dismantle his company, quietly, legally. You will use the resources we provide, but the strategy must be yours. You will crush him. If you succeed, we can discuss your inheritance. If you fail, you will walk away from here and I will never see you again." He was giving me a test, an impossible task for a man who had just lost his own company, but it was more than that. It was a chance. Finally, I had access to the Phoenix Group's influence, their lawyers, their financial weapons. Laura and Frank had no idea what was coming. In a matter of months, they would be bankrupt and disgraced, their stolen empire turned to dust. But first, I needed to prove my worth to Edward. I needed to learn how to be a shark in a world full of them, and I was a very, very fast learner. The meeting with Edward ended without a handshake. I walked out of that dark, wood-paneled room and into the cold city air, a different man than the one who had walked in. The despair that had been my constant companion for months was gone, replaced by something else, something sharp and cold. It wasn't hope, it was purpose. The next morning, a car with blacked-out windows was waiting for me. It took me to an anonymous glass tower downtown, to an office that didn't have a name on the door. Inside, 3 people were waiting in a sterile conference room, a man and 2 women. They didn't introduce themselves with names, only with their functions: finance, legal, and data. They were my team, my weapons. They were cold, efficient, and looked at me with the detached curiosity of scientists observing a new specimen. The finance expert, a man with graying hair and eyes that missed nothing, slid a tablet across the polished table. On the screen was a complete profile of my target. His name was Jared. He was 28 years old, the founder of a small but aggressive investment firm called Momentum Capital. He was exactly what Edward had described: arrogant, flashy, and overconfident. He drove a bright yellow sports car, was featured in magazines for young entrepreneurs, and his social media was a curated stream of success. He reminded me of a younger, more foolish version of myself before life had taught me that trust was a liability. His entire company is built on one risky algorithm, the data analyst said, her voice flat. It predicts short-term market trends. It's been successful, but it's volatile. His investors are mostly new money, easily spooked, the lawyer added. He's cut corners on compliance, nothing major but a pattern of small violations. He's moving too fast to cover his tracks properly. I spent the next 2 weeks in that room, sleeping only a few hours a night on a couch in the corner. I devoured every piece of information they gave me. I learned about short selling, about proxy battles, about how to use the media as a weapon. I wasn't just learning business tactics. I was learning how to dismantle a man's life, piece by piece, without ever leaving a fingerprint. The weakness I had shown with Laura and Frank was being burned away, replaced by a cold, hard resolve. This was my training, and Jared was my sparring partner. He just didn't know it yet. My first move was quiet. Using the Phoenix Group's vast network, we identified Momentum Capital's 3 largest investors. The legal expert drafted irresistible personalized offers for them to move their capital to a much safer, more established fund, secretly controlled by the group. It wasn't hostile. It was presented as a prudent financial decision. Within a week, 2 of them had pulled their money out. It was a significant blow, but not a fatal one. Jared would feel the sting, but he wouldn't know where it came from. He'd blame the market. Bad luck. The second move was more personal. Our data analyst found a key programmer at Momentum, a quiet genius who was responsible for maintaining the very algorithm the company depended on. We learned he was underpaid, and his son had a rare medical condition. A shell corporation made him a job offer, triple his salary and a private health plan that would cover all his son's medical needs, no questions asked. He resigned the next day, taking his intimate knowledge of the algorithm's flaws with him. I watched the fallout from a distance. I saw articles online where Jared dismissed the loss of capital as a strategic realignment. I saw his confident posts on social media become a little less frequent. He was a ship that had sprung 2 leaks, and he was too arrogant to see the storm that was gathering. He was trying to plug the holes, unaware that I was about to blow a hole in the hull. The lawyer had found it, a small clause in a partnership agreement Jared had signed 2 years ago, a detail he had overlooked in his rush to secure funding. It gave his original seed investor certain rights that could be triggered if the company's valuation dropped by more than 20% in a single quarter. With the 2 big investors gone, we were close to that trigger point. The seed investor was an old man who had retired to Florida and just wanted to play golf. The Phoenix Group bought his shares, and the rights that came with them, for a price he couldn't refuse. We now owned the kill switch to Jared's company. I sat in that cold conference room looking at the plan we had laid out. It was a machine of pure destruction, elegant and brutal. I felt a surge of power that was almost frightening. This was what it felt like to be a shark. Edward wanted me to crush him, legally, quietly. I was about to do just that. I picked up the phone to give the final order, my hand steady. For a moment, I thought of the man I used to be, the man who built things, who trusted people. He was a ghost, a memory. In his place was someone new, someone forged in betrayal, and he was just getting started. Laura and Frank had created a monster, and he was finally ready to hunt. My finger hovered over the call button. The phone felt heavy in my hand like a weapon. I wasn't just making a call. I was signing a death warrant for a man's dream, a man I didn't even know. A part of the old me, the man who built things, screamed in protest, but that voice was weak now, a whisper in a storm. The man who had been betrayed, the man who had lost everything, was in control. He didn't build, he demolished. I pressed the button. "It's Thomas," I said, my voice steady. "Execute the plan. Trigger the clause." There was a quiet, understood on the other end, and then the line went dead. I didn't feel triumph. I didn't feel guilt. I felt a profound and unsettling calm, the kind a surgeon must feel before making the first cut. It was just a procedure, a necessary step. The next 48 hours were a blur of digital chaos, all orchestrated from our quiet conference room. The moment we triggered the clause, the Phoenix Group, as the new majority rights holder, called an emergency board meeting. The agenda was simple, a vote of no confidence in the CEO, Jared. His remaining investors, already nervous from the capital flight, were easy to persuade. They saw a sinking ship, and we were offering them the only lifeboat. I watched it all unfold on a series of monitors. I saw the emails flying, the panicked messages on internal company chats that our analyst had access to. I saw Jared's digital world catch fire. He tried to fight back, of course. He sent out furious emails, tried to call emergency meetings of his own, posted defiant messages on social media about a hostile corporate raid, but he was a man shouting in a hurricane. His words were blown away away before anyone could hear them. He had no idea who was attacking him or from where. He was fighting shadows. By the second day, it was over. Momentum Capital was ours. The algorithm was ours. His office, his employees, his brand, all belonged to the Phoenix Group. Edward walked into the room, a small, satisfied smile on his face. He placed a folder on the table in front of me. They betrayed me with lies and took everything I built. What would you do if you discovered your wife and lawyer were plotting against you? Comment your thoughts and share this betrayal. He's requested a meeting with the new owners, Edward said. He wants to know who did this to him. I think you should be there. It's important to look your opponent in the eye when you defeat them. It solidifies the victory. I wasn't sure I wanted to. This had been an abstract exercise so far, a game played on screens. Seeing the man I had broken felt different, but Edward was right. I needed to see it. I needed to feel it, to prepare for Laura and Frank. The meeting was held in Jared's old office, my new office, technically. I walked in with two of the Phoenix Group's lawyers, stone-faced men in expensive suits. Jared was already sitting at the conference table. He looked terrible. His flashy clothes were wrinkled, his eyes were red-rimmed, and the arrogant smirk I'd seen in his magazine photos was gone, replaced by a hollow look of disbelief. He looked like a kid who had his favorite toy smashed in front of him. He stared at me, a flicker of confusion in his eyes. He was expecting some corporate titan, some old money rival. Not me. I was nobody. Who are you? He asked, his voice cracking. I didn't answer. I just sat down across from him. One of the lawyers slid the folder across the table. This is the transfer of ownership, the lawyer said, his voice devoid of any emotion. Momentum Capital and all its assets are now under the control of our client's holding company. Jared opened the folder, his hands trembling. He scanned the pages, his face growing paler with every line he read. He saw the names of the investors who had abandoned him, the legal clauses that had been used against him. He saw the perfectly executed plan that had dismantled his life's work in less than a week. Finally, his eyes landed back on me. The confusion was gone, replaced by a dawning, horrified understanding. He might not have known my name, but he could see it in my face. I wasn't a businessman. I was an executioner. Why? He whispered. It was the only word he could manage. We've never even met. Why would you do this? I leaned forward slightly. I thought about telling him the truth, that he was just practice, that his company was a training ground, a place for me to learn how to be ruthless, that he was a stepping stone on my path to a much bigger, more personal war. But I said nothing. I just looked at him, letting the silence hang in the air. I wanted him to understand that there was no reason he could comprehend. It wasn't business. It wasn't personal. It was power. It was a demonstration. He slumped back in his chair, defeated. The fight was gone. I had not just taken his company. I had taken his spirit. I stood up to leave. As I reached the door, I paused and looked back at him one last time. You moved too fast, I said, my voice cold and flat. You didn't cover your tracks. It was the only explanation he would ever get. As I walked out, leaving him in the ruins of his career, I felt the last piece of the old Thomas die. The man who left that room was not the man who had entered. He was harder, colder, and ready. The test was over. My training was complete. Now it was time to go after Laura and Frank. They had no idea what was coming. They still saw me as the broken man they had left behind. They were about to meet the monster they had created. The war against Jared was a dress rehearsal. The real performance was for an audience of two. For 6 months, I stayed in the shadows, a ghost with a growing bank account. I used my grandfather's money and the profits from dismantling Jared's empire to build my own. I hired the best, not flashy lawyers like Frank, but quiet, methodical sharks who moved silently through the deep waters of corporate law. My lead counsel was a man named Alan, a stoic older gentleman who saw the law not as a set of rules, but as a weapon to be sharpened. While I worked, I watched Laura and Frank. They were living the life they had stolen from me. They bought a bigger house, a ridiculous mansion with white pillars that looked like a bad movie set. They joined the most exclusive country club in the state. Their pictures were in society magazines, smiling at galas, their arms around each other. They rebranded my old company, calling it Ascend Global, a name so generic and arrogant it made my stomach turn. They were celebrated as a power couple, a story of success. No one knew their success was built on a foundation of lies, on the ruins of my life. They grew comfortable. They believed I was gone for good, a broken man who had probably crawled into a bottle somewhere. They never looked over their shoulders. That was their mistake. They underestimated the man they had created. The opportunity came in the form of an invitation. Not for me, of course. It was the annual Children's Hospital Benefit Ball, the biggest charity event of the year. And this year, the main sponsors, the guests of honor, were Laura and Frank of Ascend Global. They had bought their way to the top of the social ladder. Frank was scheduled to give the keynote address. It was perfect. A stage, an audience, and a spotlight. I was going to burn their world down in front of everyone they wanted to impress. The night of the gala, I looked at myself in the mirror. I was wearing a tailored tuxedo that cost more than my first car. My hair was cut short, sharp. The timid, trusting man who used to live in my skin was gone. My eyes were cold. There was no fear, no hesitation, just a quiet, patient hunger for what was to come. Alan had everything in place. The documents, the media contacts, the digital assets, all waiting for my signal. I didn't arrive with the other guests. I waited. I let the ballroom fill up. I watched on a small small monitor in a car parked down the street as the city's elite mingled, sipping champagne. Then I saw Frank take the stage to a round of applause. Laura was sitting at the head table in the front, beaming, looking at him with a look of pure adoration, the same look she used to give me. That was my cue. I walked through the grand entrance of the hotel ballroom. The security guard at the door moved to stop me, his eyes scanning for an invitation. I didn't even look at him. Alan, who had entered earlier, simply stepped forward and showed the guard a badge. The guard nodded and stepped aside. The room was a sea of glittering dresses and black tuxedos. Everyone's attention was on the stage, where Frank had just started his speech. He was talking about community, about giving back, about the importance of integrity. The hypocrisy was so thick I could barely breathe. I walked slowly along the edge of the room, my footsteps silent on the thick carpet. Nobody noticed me at first. They were all captivated by the charming liar on the stage. But then Laura saw me. Her smile vanished. Her perfectly made-up face went pale as if she'd seen a ghost. Her wine glass trembled in her hand. She nudged Frank, but he was lost in his own performance. I kept walking, my eyes locked on her. Then a few other people at her table noticed her reaction and followed her gaze. A small ripple of confusion started to spread through the room. Finally, Frank saw me. He was in the middle of a sentence about his company's ethical vision. His voice faltered. The words died on his lips. The microphone let out a soft squeal of feedback as his hand went slack. The entire ballroom fell silent. Hundreds of pairs of eyes turned from him to me. He was standing in the spotlight, exposed and confused. I had stopped at the center of the room, directly in his line of sight. I gave a small, almost imperceptible nod to Alan, who was standing by the tech booth at the back. Checkmate, I thought. And then the world behind Frank exploded. The two massive screens on either side of the stage, which had been showing the logo for Ascend Global, flickered. For a second, they went black. The silence in the room was absolute. Then they flashed back to life. But it wasn't the company logo anymore. It was a bank statement, a wire transfer for millions of dollars from my old company's account into a private shell corporation registered in Frank's name. Then another screen showed the deed to their new house, purchased by that same shell corp. Then emails, dozens of them, between Laura and Frank, laughing about how easy it had been, planning their new life, mocking me. The final image was a side-by-side comparison, the logo of my old company next to the logo for Ascend Global. They were nearly identical, a lazy, arrogant theft. The proof was undeniable, plastered 10 feet high for the entire world to see. A collective gasp went through the crowd. Frank and Laura just stood there, frozen, their faces masks of pure horror as their perfect world shattered into a million pieces right before their eyes. The silence was a physical thing. It pressed in on all sides, heavier than the ornate chandeliers hanging from the ceiling. For a few seconds, the only sound was the faint hum of the projectors displaying their ruin. I watched them, Frank paralyzed on the stage, Laura a statue of horror at her table. Their masks had not just slipped, they had been burned away, revealing the ugly truth underneath. Then, the silence broke. It started as a single whisper from a woman in a pearl necklace, a soft, shocked, "Oh my God." It was like a single stone starting an avalanche. Whispers turned to murmurs. Murmurs turned to loud, angry chatter. Phones were suddenly out, dozens of them, recording the evidence on the screens, recording the faces of Frank and Laura. The flashes were like machine gun fire. The city's elite, the very people they had worked so hard to impress, were now their judges, jury, and executioners. Frank finally moved. He raised a trembling hand as if to shield his eyes from the glare of his own crimes. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He looked desperately at Laura, but she wasn't looking at him. Her eyes were locked on me. They were wide with a kind of primal terror I had never seen before. It wasn't just fear of being caught. It was the fear of a predator that has suddenly found itself prey. I saw her mouth the word "how." I gave her no answer. I just stood there, a ghost at their feast, letting the chaos I had unleashed wash over the room. People were getting up from their tables now. Some were pointing, others were walking out in disgust. The chairman of the Children's Hospital Board, a stern-faced man named Howard, was on his feet, his face purple with rage. He was marching toward the stage. Frank saw him coming and finally found his voice. "This is a lie," he yelled into the microphone, his voice cracking. "A fabrication. This is a desperate attack by a bitter man." But his words were drowned out by the evidence. Alan had made sure of it. A new slide appeared on the screen, a recorded phone call. Frank's voice, smooth and confident, filled the ballroom. He was talking to his offshore banker, laughing about how Thomas will never know what hit him. The audio was crystal clear. It was the final nail in their coffin. A wave of revulsion swept through the crowd. That's when I heard it. A faint sound from outside growing steadily louder. A siren, then another, and another. A smile touched my lips for the first time that night. Alan had timed it perfectly. The grand doors of the ballroom burst open, but it wasn't more guests arriving. It was 4 uniformed police officers, followed by 2 detectives in plain clothes. The crowd parted for them like the Red Sea. The senior detective, a man with tired eyes and a determined jaw, held up a badge to the stunned event security. He scanned the room, his eyes landing on the stage. Frank saw them, and his last bit of composure crumbled. He dropped the microphone, which clattered loudly on the stage floor. He looked like a cornered animal, his eyes darting from the police to the exits, but there was no escape. Laura let out a small, choked sob. She tried to shrink into her chair to become invisible, but it was too late. Every eye in that room, every camera, was on her and her lover. The detectives walked calmly, purposefully, through the chaos. One went toward the stage for Frank, the other walked directly to Laura's table. "Frank," the detective on the stage said, his voice calm but firm, cutting through the noise. "You need to come with us." Frank just stared at him, shaking his head slowly. No, you don't understand." The other detective reached Laura's table. He looked down at her, his expression unreadable. "Ma'am," he said, "please stand up." Laura looked up at him, her face a mess of tears and smeared makeup. She looked past him, her eyes searching for me one last time. In them, I saw the final, desperate plea of a person who knows the game is over. I just held her gaze, my face a blank canvas. I gave her nothing. No pity. No anger, no satisfaction, just emptiness. That, I knew, would haunt her more than anything. The detective gently took her arm. Another officer was placing handcuffs on Frank, who had started to ramble incoherently about a misunderstanding. The flashes from the cameras were blinding now. Reporters who had been tipped off by Alan were pushing their way into the room. It wasn't just a scandal anymore. It was a media circus, and I stood in the middle of it all, perfectly still, watching the world I had built for them burn to the ground. This was not the end of their fall. This was just the beginning. The chaos in the ballroom was a symphony of their destruction, and I was its silent conductor. Frank was still shouting, a stream of nonsense about setups and conspiracies, but his voice was swallowed by the storm of camera flashes and reporters' questions. They were like sharks that had smelled blood in the water. "Mr. Frank, is it true you embezzled millions? Laura, were you in on it from the beginning? What about the offshore accounts?" They were led through the crowd, a miserable parade for all their former friends to see. Frank, red-faced and sweating, stumbled as an officer pushed him forward. Laura was worse. She tried to cover her face with her cuffed hands, her glamorous dress now looking like a costume on a broken doll. Her quiet sobs were lost in the noise. Their power, their arrogance, it had all evaporated in an instant, leaving behind two pathetic, frightened people. The guests didn't help. They backed away, creating a wide path. Some held up their phones, recording the spectacle. These were the same people who had laughed at Frank's jokes and admired Laura's jewelry just an hour ago. Now they looked at them with a mixture of horror and disgust. Their social status was a disease, and no one wanted to be infected. Alan stood beside me, watching the scene with a grim satisfaction. "It's done," he said quietly, his voice barely audible over the din. "No," I replied, my eyes fixed on the closing ballroom doors as they were taken away. "It's just started." The next 24 hours were a blur of headlines and breaking news. The story was everywhere. Alan and I watched from his temporary office, a suite in a downtown hotel, as the empire they had stolen began to crumble like sand. Every news channel led with their mugshots. Frank looked defiant and foolish. Laura looked utterly destroyed. Her eyes were hollow, her perfect makeup gone, replaced by streaks of tears. The headlines were brutal. "Society lawyer and wife arrested in $6.7 million fraud scheme. Tech founder Thomas betrayed by wife and best friend. The high society scam, how they did it." The phone calls started almost immediately. The board of the company they had taken from me called an emergency meeting. Investors were panicking. Major clients, seeing the scandal, began pulling their contracts. The company they had fought so hard to steal was now toxic, its value plummeting by the hour. Alan took the calls, his voice calm and professional, explaining that the legitimate owner, me, was ready to step in and stabilize the situation once the legal mess was cleared. Their social world fell apart even faster. I saw an article online that night. The prestigious country club where they held court every weekend had already suspended their membership, pending expulsion. A charity board that Laura chaired had scrubbed her name and picture from their website as if she had never existed. Emails were sent out. Text messages flew back and forth. In the world they cared so much about, they had ceased to be people. They were just a scandal, a cautionary tale whispered over cocktails. I felt a strange sense of emptiness watching it all. I had imagined this moment for months, dreamed of their public humiliation, but seeing it happen was different. It wasn't joy I felt, but a cold, hard finality. It was like watching a surgeon remove a tumor. The process was ugly and bloody, but it was necessary to survive. The poison that had been coursing through my life was finally being purged. The next morning, a new story broke. The bank that had given Frank and Laura a massive loan to finalize their takeover, using the company's own inflated assets as collateral, had frozen all their accounts. They had no access to the stolen money. They couldn't even post bail. Alan showed me the article on his tablet. "They're trapped," he said. "They have nothing. No money, No friends, no reputation. The only thing they have left is a long legal battle they can't afford to fight. I nodded slowly, looking at their faces on the screen. They had tried to erase me, to leave me with nothing. They had laughed while they did it. Now the world was erasing them, and there was no one left to hear them scream. The foundation of their lives was gone. All that was left was the fall, and I knew it was going to be a long, long way down. The courts would be next. The trials, the evidence, the public record of every single lie and every stolen dollar. Their private betrayal was about to become a very public and permanent record of their greed. The legal system, Frank used to tell me, was a slow-moving beast. He'd say it with a smirk, implying that its slowness was a feature he could exploit. He knew how to drag things out, how to bury opponents in paperwork until they gave up. Now that same beast was turning its lazy, methodical gaze on him and Laura, and there was nowhere for them to run. Alan explained the process to me in that hotel suite that had become our war room. The initial charges were just the beginning. The district attorney's office was building a massive case. Every document from my grandfather's trust, every transaction Frank had ever hidden, was now a nail for their coffins. They haven't made bail, Alan said, looking up from his laptop. Their assets are frozen solid. They tried to get a bond using some property Laura's family owns, but the judge deemed them a flight risk. I pictured them in a cell. Frank, who loved tailored suits and expensive watches, now in a standard-issue jumpsuit. Laura, who couldn't stand anything less than silk sheets on a thin plastic mattress. The image didn't bring me the satisfaction I expected. It just felt correct, like a line of code finally executing after an error was fixed. Their first court appearance was for a bail hearing a week later. I went. I had to see it for myself. Alan advised against it, said it would give them a target for their anger, but I needed to witness this part of the process. I sat in the back of the public gallery, wearing a simple hat and glasses, just another face in the crowd. When they were led in, a gasp went through the courtroom. They were shackled at the wrists and ankles. Frank's hair was a mess, and his face was pale and puffy. He had a look of disbelief, as if he still couldn't comprehend that the rules applied to him. But it was Laura who broke me. She was a shadow, thin, trembling, her eyes darting around the room, empty of all the fire and life she once had. She looked like a lost child. For a moment, just a moment, I felt a pang of something that might have been pity. This was the woman I had loved, the mother of my children. Then I remembered her laughter at the barbecue, her hand on Frank's arm, the casual cruelty in her eyes as she told me I was finished. The pity vanished, replaced by a cold, hard calm. They were assigned a public defender, a tired-looking man named Philip who seemed overwhelmed by the sheer volume of discovery the prosecutor was handing him. I watched Frank, the brilliant, ruthless lawyer, having to whisper to this harried man, his entire future in the hands of a stranger paid by the state. It was a more perfect humiliation than I could have ever designed. Their eyes found me in the back row. Frank's gaze was pure venom, a silent promise of retribution that we both knew he could never deliver. Laura's was different. Her eyes locked on mine, and they were filled with a desperate, pleading terror. She was begging me to stop it, to turn back time, to make it all go away. I just stared back, my face a blank mask, and gave her nothing. I was a mirror reflecting the emptiness she had created. After the judge denied bail again and set a date for the next hearing, I left. The cold air outside felt good. Alan was waiting by his car. How was it? He asked. It was necessary, I said. The weeks turned into a month. The legal grind continued. Alan worked tirelessly, not just with the prosecutors, but on the civil side. We filed lawsuits to reclaim every stolen asset. The company, my house, the art, the cars. We were unwinding their fraud piece by painful piece. The beauty of my grandfather's trust was its simplicity and its age. It predated all their complex schemes, a solid foundation of truth that their tower of lies couldn't stand on. We discovered they had tried to hide money in offshore accounts, but Alan's team was relentless. They followed the trail, working with international authorities. One by one, those doors were slammed shut. They were trapped in a cage of their own making, and the walls were closing in every day. I focused on rebuilding. I started meeting with the board of my old company, outlining a plan to save it from the reputational damage they had caused. I was taking back control, not just for revenge, but because it was mine. I had built it. Its code was my language. One evening, Alan called me. They're offering a plea deal, he said. A pretty weak one. The DA is considering it to avoid a long trial. My blood ran cold. What kind of deal? Frank gets 7 years, Laura gets 2 years probation. They forfeit most of the assets, but not all. They'd get to keep her family home. No, I said instantly. The word was sharp, final. Absolutely not. They don't get to walk away with anything. They don't get to have a life waiting for them when they're done. I want a trial. I want every single lie read into the public record. I want them to sit there and listen to what they did in front of a jury and the world. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Then Alan said, I was hoping you'd say that. I've already told the DA we have more evidence to submit. The trial date was set for 3 months later. It was going to be the final act. Not just a legal battle, but a public reckoning. Frank and Laura would have to face not just a judge, but the truth, stripped of all its legal jargon. And I would be there in the front row to watch them. The day of the trial felt like the final scene of a movie I never wanted to be in. The courtroom was cold and formal, all dark dark wood and high ceilings that seemed to swallow sound. I sat in the front row with Alan. Across the room, Laura and Frank sat at the defendant's table with their new, cheaper lawyers. They looked pale and thin. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a brittle fear that was plain to see. Laura wouldn't look at me. Frank kept glancing over, his eyes searching for something in my face, but I gave him nothing. I was a stone wall. The prosecutor laid out the case with brutal efficiency. Alan had given them everything on a silver platter. They showed the jury the forged documents, the fake signatures, the web of shell corporations Frank had created. They presented bank records showing millions of dollars moving from my company accounts to offshore havens controlled by him and Laura. It was a slow, methodical demolition of their lies. The most powerful moment came when they put my grandfather's trust document on the big screen. Its old, elegant script stood in stark contrast to the pixelated, fraudulent paperwork Frank had created. One was real, a legacy of hard work. The other was a cheap imitation, a monument to greed. I was called to the stand. I told my story. I didn't raise my voice. I just spoke the truth, calmly and clearly. I talked about the 20 years I spent building my company. I talked about the barbecues on Sundays. I talked about how Frank was like a brother to me and how I had loved Laura with everything I had. When I finished, the courtroom was silent. The jury was out for less than 4 hours. When they filed back in, I held my breath. The foreman handed a piece of paper to the clerk. He cleared his throat and began to read. On the charge of grand larceny, we the jury find the defendant, Frank, guilty. A small gasp escaped Laura. On the charge of conspiracy to commit fraud, we the jury find the defendant, Frank, guilty. The list went on. Guilty on all counts. Then it was Laura's turn. Guilty, guilty, guilty. With every word, they seemed to shrink, collapsing in on themselves. Frank's face was white. He stared at his hands on the table as if he'd never seen them before. Laura finally broke, burying her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking with sobs. The judge banged his gavel. Bail is revoked. The defendants will be remanded into custody until sentencing. That's when the true collapse began. 2 court officers moved behind them. The sound of handcuffs clicking shut was loud in the quiet room. Frank didn't resist. He looked like a puppet with its strings cut. Laura cried out, a raw, desperate sound as they pulled her to her feet. It was over. The fight was gone. The fallout was immediate and spectacular. It was front-page news. Tech mogul bilked by wife and best friend. Our country club membership was revoked. Their names became symbols of betrayal. Alan's civil suits moved forward without resistance, and we clawed back everything. The house, the cars, the stolen art, the money. The company was returned to my control, damaged but salvageable. The board welcomed me back, and we began the long process of rebuilding trust. 6 months later, I received a letter. It was from Frank in prison. He asked if I would visit him. I thought about it for a day. Then I told Alan to arrange it. I needed to see it for myself. The visiting room was a gray, lifeless place that smelled of disinfectant. He was brought in wearing a standard prison jumpsuit. He was gaunt. His hair was graying at the temples, and his eyes were hollow. The confident, back-slapping lawyer was gone forever. We sat across from each other at a small table, a thick pane of glass between us. He picked up the phone on his side. I picked up mine. Thank you for coming, Thomas, he said, his voice raspy. Why did you ask me here, Frank? He looked down at the table, then back up at me. There were tears in his eyes. I needed to tell you. I'm sorry. I know it means nothing now, but I am. I was jealous of you for years, of your success, your mind. Everything just came so easy to you, and I hated myself for it. I let it turn me into a monster. It was the 5% of humanity I never thought I'd see, the flicker of a man he used to be, buried under layers of greed and resentment. I listened, and I felt nothing, not anger, not pity, just a quiet emptiness where our friendship used to be. The storm inside me had passed. You didn't just steal my money, Frank, I said softly. You stole my past. You took 20 years of my memories, and you set them on fire. He closed his eyes, a single tear tracing a path down his cheek. I know. I placed the phone back on its cradle. I stood up and walked away without looking back, leaving him there with the ruins of the life he had chosen. I walked out of the prison and into the bright afternoon sun. For the first time in a very long time, I was free from a life destroyed to prison cells. I reclaimed my past and built a future they never saw coming. What did you think of my revenge? Subscribe for more intense stories like this.